All right, so we're picking up on the seven seals prophecy again in Revelation. We're looking at the seven vials, which are the last seven visions, approximately seven visions in the series in the book of Revelation. And we are going to start just with the first vial. The vial means a bowl, and these are called the bowls, the last bowls of God's wrath. Basically, God in the vision pours out, one of the angels, one at a time, pours out his vials, bowls of wrath upon the earth, and it talks about all the great and terrible things leading up to the second coming of Jesus Christ. So we had a bit of a look at an introduction to that last time, and we saw the various symbols there that are used. The whole Seven Vial series is about the fall of the iron and clay kingdoms from the prophecy of Daniel, the feet of iron and clay, if you know that. And that basically represents the Catholic nations of Europe since the breakup of the Western Roman Empire. And so that's been going for about 1,500 years, but that is to continue with the 10 nations of Europe sort of changing here and there, but basically staying in that number up until the return of Jesus Christ. It's always going to be, as the scripture says, a mingled situation, mingled cultures, mingled strengths, some strong, some broken, and that changes from time to time as different nations sort of take precedence and come to power, and other ones fall back in power, etc. So the first four, and particularly the first five of the seven vial visions, as we mentioned last time, particularly dealing with the French Revolution sort of era, which was at the end of the 1700s, leading into the 1800s, and sort of culminated in the time of, or at least the first four visions, the first four vials, culminated in the time of Napoleon and his march across Europe. And then the fifth one, which is very connected with those, has to do with the loss of the papal states and great loss to the papal kingdoms. And the other ones lead up to the 20th century and our time and the things that have happened there. So, again, just to refresh the memory, the first four vials are about, first of all, the French Revolution, the outbreaking of the French Revolution. Then all of those vials are about the French Revolution, but it sort of deals with it in various parts. So first of all, the outbreak and the basic sort of principle behind it all. Then it deals with the great revolutionary wars at sea, people like Nelson we've heard of, and the great battles there. Again, then the revolutionary wars upon and throughout Europe. Then we have the Napoleonic Wars as Napoleon came to power as a result of the revolution, and he took over. And again, he began waging war throughout Europe. So they're all connected there, those four. And the first four in each set of seven, the seven seals, the seven trumpets, and the seven vials, all are connected in one way or another. And they are connected with each other as well in some cases, which we'll show at a later time. So today, we just click on that screen again. That's right. So today we're just going to have a look at the things behind the beginning of the French Revolution and what happened there. So one of the first questions, I suppose, that we sort of think to ourselves, or I did when I heard about these things many years ago when I was a young man, was what does France have to do with anything? And what does the French Revolution have to do with Bible prophecy? Why are we talking about the French Revolution? And again, if you take it into context, you recognise that what we're talking about is the 10 nations of Europe which took over from the old Roman Empire. So we're talking about places like France and Portugal and Spain and Italy and these sort of places that we know of even today. And they had their beginnings after 476 and the fall of the Western Roman Empire that got broken up by the Goths, as we've talked about, coming in, and other peoples and the Huns coming in there and breaking it up into various nations. One of the peoples that came through were called the Franks, and they were the people that particularly settled in what was called Gaul, and which is now called France. The reason that we're talking about France in particular is because at the time of the French Revolution, France was pretty much the great nation of Europe there, and in particular of the Catholic European nations. And uh, as it turns out, when the nations of Europe were forming after the breakup of the Western Roman Empire, we see that it was France that really, first of all, latched onto Catholicism, and then the others followed suit, and we ended up with these Catholic nations under the sway of the papacy, which was ruling from Rome. So the first king of France was named Clovis. I think that's how you pronounce it. And there's a lot of French names in all of this. And I did German at high school, not French. So I'm guessing with a lot of them. So some of them I'm not sure about. I'll just say loudly how I think it is and just go ho 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 afterwards. So it sounds very French. Okay, so Clovis the first, king of the Franks and ruler of much of Gaul from 481 to 511, a key period during the transformation of the Roman Empire into Europe. The historical Clovis remains a shadowy figure, a warrior who solidified a kingdom, corresponded with bishops, and converted to Catholic Christianity. And supposedly it was his wife, I think her name was Clotilde, something like that, and she was the one who particularly encouraged him to become Catholic and to get their children christened and all the rest of it. And so he did that after winning a few wars. He sort of credited that to the Christian God, but he was joining Catholic Christianity at the time. So it says millennium and a half later, he remains significant for the French. He was the founder of France, and a derivation of his name, Louis, became the principal name of its kings. And we're talking, when we talk about the French Revolution, we're talking a period 1300 years later, and the kings at that particular time were named Louis. And so we're actually going to talk about one of those as well. So that became the principal name of its kings. So he had quite an effect, obviously. His baptism, or probably his christening, is considered one of the formative dates in French history. For Catholics, he was the first major Germanic Catholic king, and Pope John Paul II, who was a recent pope, of course, celebrated a mass in Reims in 1996 in honour of the 15th centenary of his baptism. Now, John Paul II also made a comment here, which uses a phrase which you'll find a lot when they're talking about France in history. And he made this comment: France has been one of the great nations marked by the Christian faith, meaning Catholic faith, since the dawn of history. And after the fall of the Roman Empire, it was the first nation of the West to declare itself the daughter of the Church, the eldest daughter of the Church. So France has become known as the eldest son or the eldest daughter of the Catholic Church because it was the first of the 10 nations that really adopted Catholicism, stood up for it, and joined itself together with the Pope. So that's one of the reasons why when these things all start come crashing down in the 7 Vials, that it is France that cops it first. And then things spread out to there. We're talking about the French Revolution, but we're talking about a revolution that spread right throughout Europe. And Napoleon himself, who later came on the scene as a result, he said, a revolution in France is always, sooner or later, followed by a revolution in Europe. There's another fellow later who said something like, when France sneezes, Europe catches a cold, and which is quite relevant to some of the things we're going to talk about here. So it was a French Revolution, but it became a European, almost a worldwide revolution because it had its effects in other parts of the world as well. So we're going to be talking about the first vial, so we'll see what the scripture has to say. Just like the first few trumpets, most of the prophecies here only consist of one or maybe one or two verses. And again, these are things that happened fairly suddenly, like they did with the first seals. And so they get, maybe 1-2 verses to each vision. And what you find with some of the other prophecies, like some of the ones in the later trumpets, was that they tended to be longer and sometimes go for a whole chapter because they dealt with something that was more far-reaching and a longer era rather than just a battle or something that was of shorter duration. So we read there in the scripture, it says, "And I heard a great voice out of the temple saying to the seven angels, Go your ways and pour out the vials of the wrath of God upon the earth. And the first went and poured out his vial upon the earth, and there fell a noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast, and upon them which worshipped his image." So the symbol that it uses here is an ulcerous type of a sore. If you look this up in the Greek, and it's a word that's used in the New Testament, and also when they wrote the Greek translation of the Old Testament, they used the same word for some of the plagues and things there. And it's talking about the type of sore that is a pretty disgusting sort of a sore. It's an eruption from the surface of the skin, and of course it comes out, and you've got pus and all this. That's the sort of thing it's talking about. Pretty horrible sort of a thing. And so it's a loathsome thing, it's a grievous thing, it's a very painful thing, and it's a very, as it says, a very disgusting, noisome sore. So this is an eruption which has sort of taken place upon the men, and it mentions that the particular people it's talking about, those who had the mark of the beast, upon them which worshipped his image. So the beast, and again there's a whole few chapters that we haven't gone through, but we will at some stage, refers to the papacy and the Catholic system, and those that worshipped his image are those that have basically sort of followed after his ideals and taken upon themselves the beliefs of the Catholic Church. So this was particularly to affect the Catholic parts of Europe, and it was to be something that was going to erupt from within. A bit different to wounds in the sense of, that are inflicted by somebody coming at you and hitting you with something, or, cutting you with a sword. That's something that comes from without. But these erupting sores come from corruption inside, something wrong inside that takes place. So just before we get to the era of the French Revolution, which was 1789, was where it actually started. We see in the middle of the 1700s, around this particular area in the 1700s, there were a lot of changes happening in the world. It was what was called the Enlightenment era. And there were a lot of philosophers who were rising and bringing in different ideas, things about, they were starting to push away from the whole idea of kings and monarchies, and they were starting to talk about science, they were starting to talk about reason. And the nations were coming out of this very dark age of superstition and idolatry and everything else, and all the absurdities that the Catholic Church had sort of placed on people. People were starting to look into science, people like Isaac Newton in the late 1600s, and his methods of observation and other things. They had started to realise that they didn't have to accept all the superstitious nonsense, that they should be checking with the results of their own eyes and doing their experiments and everything else. And they started to doubt as to whether they should just accept the situation as it was, political and otherwise, or whether they could make their own way, do their own thing, basically. There were quite a few of them. Some of the ones that get mentioned quite a bit to do with the lead up to the French Revolution. People like these men here, Voltaire and Rousseau, and also another one, Diderot and Montesquieu, or something like that. However you pronounce that one. Okay, so these men had various ideas, and they started to. It was in the age, of course, we now have the printing press, and they began to publish a lot. There was a lot that was going on in the 1700s, in the mid-1700s. There were a lot of people loved to get together in various clubs and groups, and they would discuss all sorts of philosophies and ideas. And the world was sort of moving away from the superstitious nonsense of Catholicism and starting to see through that. And they were also starting to see the cruelty and the things that the Catholic Church had done, the corruption. There was a lot of financial corruption and other things as well. And it was starting to become something that was obvious to a lot of people. And so there were a lot of people who were very upset about that, and they started looking at all the things that were being done and the injustices, and they were writing about it, they were speaking about it, and they were looking for other ideas. As a result, people like Voltaire, who looked at the Catholic Church in particular, and he saw all the terrible things they were doing, he got turned off Christianity altogether, and he became quite anti-religious. And all of these guys had some interesting things to say, and some things that you've probably heard quoted from time to time, but didn't know it came from them. And they made good sense with a lot of things that they said. But unfortunately, what it sort of set the world up for was something that's not very good. And so there was a lot of atheistic speaking. There was a lot of other philosophers as well who were very atheistic, and they started to come up with various ideas. We have here, there's a couple of the publications that they were putting out. Monty, for better pronunciation of his name, he wrote something called The Spirit of the Law, and has started to believe in trying to change the political situation. Instead of just having a king who reigns supreme, he thought, should divide things up into the judiciary and the various other aspects of people who sort of create the laws and people who put the laws into effect, and separate all these different things out so that they balanced one another, had checks and balances. So he wrote something along those lines, they wrote all sorts of books. There's another fellow who wrote, Rousseau, who sort of came to believe that mankind was basically good and that he was innocent and pure when he was born, if you like, but the systems of the world corrupted him. And he particularly looked at, again, the church, the nobility, the monarchy, and the governments, and decided that they were the problem. And he wrote a book here, which is on the right-hand side there, The Social Contract. And again, that had great influence. He wrote some others as well that did so as well. The one in the middle is what we would call an encyclopedia. It's actually one of the first encyclopedias in the 1700s. The thought as we know it now of an encyclopedia was something that was coming together. And he wrote, and with some of these other philosophers, began to gather all the knowledge that they could of all sorts of different things, not just the sciences, but practical things, and farming and agriculture and anything that they could think of, and try to compile it all together, put it into multi-volumes. And this one was put together in the early 1700s, and it actually set the example for the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is one that which is still around and which we are more aware of, which sort of came together in the next couple of decades after that. So they were trying to put together science and reasoning and observation and all these sorts of things, but it was very much sort of pushing away from anything that was Christian. The trouble was that most of what was called Christian wasn't really Christian, and so they could see that was wrong, and they were moving away to more of an atheistic sort of belief. So Voltaire, who was one who wrote thousands of volumes of stuff, but he was one who was very influential, and again, he was moving away from the idea of religion. He did actually believe in God, or a God, a creator, but he didn't believe in religion from what he could see. So he's probably like a lot of people. So he makes this quote here, and this is back in 1764. The French Revolution was going to happen about 35 years later. So he said at his time, everything is preparing the way for a great revolution. It will undoubtedly take place, though I shall not be so fortunate as to see it. The French arrive at everything slowly, but surely. All of these philosophers, by the way, were all French, and they're all having great influence in France. The French arrive at everything slowly but surely. Light has been for some time gradually diffusing itself, and on the first opportunity the nation will break out. Again, this thought that, like the breaking out of an ulcer or a sore, that what's inside and which is festering, which is growing, in his opinion, of course, it's something good, but the Lord could see some terrible things were going to come forth. And it says, "In the uproar will be glorious. Happy are those who are young, for they will behold most extraordinary things." And I don't think anybody would question the fact, he didn't live to see the French Revolution, but the things that happened in the French Revolution, even today, people are still wondering how they happened, how all these things happened in what was a fairly powerful sort of a society, and in some ways things were, I was reading again a history book today, and it was just making the point that nobody could have guessed that such a thing would happen in such a place, a bit like we might think today of somewhere that's fairly stable and powerful, and all of these things suddenly being overturned. So what happened was we had a couple of Louis, and we had Louis the 14th, Louis the 15th, and then Louis the 16th. Louis the 16th was the King of France at the time of the French Revolution, and the previous kings had been involved in some wars, particularly with Britain, and also just before the French Revolution we had the American Revolution, which France got involved with, and as a result it ended up broke. It did help the Americans to gain independence from Britain, but they did end up very broke, and the Americans didn't help them. So they said, "Thank you very much for your help," but that was all they did. So when this young man, he was a young man at the time, Louis the 16th, came to power, his grandfather had died. Louis the 15th had died of smallpox, which is a sores, as we know, type disease where you break out in all sorts of sores. They're ulcerous type things, and they sort of very, very painful and can be fatal, sort of in a third of the cases. And it was something that was going around Europe. It had been plaguing the world for a very long time, and it's pretty much been eradicated. I think from what I saw, there's only a couple of places in the world where they still have it in the lab somewhere, supposedly for research if they should ever need it, but it has pretty much been eradicated in modern times. But it was pretty much one of the things that was called the plague, and probably the plague of Egypt in the Bible, where they had the boils breaking forth upon them, which we'll read about in a moment, was smallpox. Anyway, so in this era where smallpox was taking the lives of various people and the King of France, this young man found himself suddenly the King of France. And he was a very weak king. He would have been trained to be king, but he was pretty hopeless by all accounts, and couldn't make decisions, and was in lots of areas of his life he was considered to be just not up to it. And so that was him. Now he got married to a young princess from Austria, and her name was Marie Antoinette. You might have heard of her. And she is the one that supposedly, during the French Revolution time, said when she was told that the peasants didn't have any bread, that she said, "Let them eat cake." Apparently, it wouldn't have been cake. It would have been, I read somewhere, it would have been brioche, if that's how you pronounce it, which is more of a cake-like bread, I think. But apparently, she probably didn't say that anyway. So that's all just a bit of hearsay. But she was somebody who was pretty much the typical princess of the time. She was very, very spoilt, very privileged, and really wasn't in touch much with the rest of the world. And they lived a very luxurious time and life in the palace, away from Paris. Now, at the time, there were sort of three what they called three estates, or three groups of people, or classes of people in France. And one was called the clergy, which were of course, the Catholic bishops and priests and all the rest of it, and archbishops. Then you had the nobles, and then you had everybody else. And pretty much everybody else was 98% of France, and included people who were very, very poor, the peasants, working in the fields on their own land, or people like bankers and lawyers and shopkeepers and tradesmen and these sort of people. So the picture here, which a lot of these pictures, these coloured pencil type pictures that we've got here, they are taken from the Times, and there's a whole archive of them on the internet. And they are usually cartoons about the state of things at the time. So here we see the common man who is bent over, and he has riding upon his back, first of all, the clergy, which was what was called the first estate, and then the nobles, which was called the second estate, and everybody else was called the third estate. And it had a setup which was called a body that they could sort of get together if they had to, called the Estates General. This is where they got representatives from each of these three groups, and when they were making decisions, each group had one vote. And the trouble with that was that even though the third estate, the commoners, had 98% of the people, they only got one vote, whereas the clergy and the nobles got one vote each, which meant the clergy and the nobles could outvote everybody else all the time. So they basically had the power of veto over everything. I just thought I'd throw that picture in there, just a couple of waxy looking individuals, but they are some of the peasants working upon the land. Before the French Revolution, the things had sort of gotten to the point where people were not producing much. It was just subsistence for most people who were working on the land. They weren't producing extra to sort of sell, and the economy was going down. The economy was pretty bad at the time as well. The price of bread and these sorts of things, which meant everything to the people, was going up and up and up. And so there was a lot of discontent. So they called, eventually when things started getting pretty stressed, the king called to save his own neck, what was called the Estates General. It hadn't been convened for, I think, since back in the early 1600s or something like that. And so gathered together all the representatives of these three groups. And they couldn't agree on all the different things they were trying to agree on, and they couldn't even agree on how to start and all the rest of it. So in the end, what happened was the 98% who represented the third estate, they went off and they formed their own assembly, which they called the National Assembly. And they found the room locked to them, where the Estates General had met at one stage, and so they moved down the road into a tennis court, an indoor tennis court, and they formed what was called the National Assembly, and they decided, we are now the government, and we're taking over, we're changing everything. So this was the beginning of the French Revolution. This is a little plaque here, 20th of June, 1789, where they are taking the oath in the tennis court. It's called the Oath of the Tennis Court. So that's how it all happened. And then they put together this declaration and some pointers, which they called the Declaration of the Rights of Man. So this is all new stuff. They're basically throwing out the whole system that they had for so many hundreds of years, and they were putting it all behind them. They were starting afresh and redeclaring everything. So the king's position started to look rather fragile. They still, to begin with, wanted a king, but they wanted to do a lot of other things differently. So I don't need to go into all the details, but there's a famous thing that happened shortly after that called the storming of the Bastille, and that is the great fortress prison there in Paris, and they stormed that and took over the weaponry. They were afraid that the king was going to send in the troops, and they sort of went in there, released the prisoners, and actually started physically breaking down this fortress. They went into other places, including some of the Catholic institutions, and took out what they could as far as weaponry and everything else. And so this set off the Great French Revolution, and which sort of raged for some years. And things it's very hard to keep track of how all the different things changed. They started off calling themselves the National Assembly, the governing body there, but if you go through over the years, it changes about 20 times into different names, some very similar, some, bits of this and bits of that, and all sorts of things. and declaring all sorts of different things. And they had a lot of, probably in the beginning, a lot of, and took probably from some of the philosophers, some high ideals and had some things they wanted to do. But like man does, he sort of sometimes knows what's right, but he makes a mess of it trying to do it because he doesn't do it through the power of God. And things all fell apart along the way. One of the main characters in the revolution there was this man named Robespierre, and he was somebody who was of the Third Estate, and he ended up being a leader along with a few others. And he got involved to begin with. He was in his early life. He was very much for the king, and he was very much against violence and all this sort of thing. But by the end of the French Revolution, he brought in what was called the Reign of Terror, and he was the one that was responsible for guillotining so many tens of thousands of people. So we ended up with a situation where mobs began to rule and things began to change from one moment to the next. And you have some party in power, and suddenly the next party comes in, pulls them down, sends them off to the executions. Then the next party sort of breaks in on them and sends them away, and it's sort of in a state of constant flux and change and massacres and all sorts of things. So there was a fellow at the time that created what was called the guillotine, and it was supposedly a humane method of execution of chopping people's heads off. And so they used this machine. They used lots of other things as well, but that was a figure of the French Revolution. At the time, we won't go through this tonight because that's one of the other vials. But they started also having an effect on the nations around about Europe. Europe got very panicky when they saw these people reacting. Eventually, they saw France executed Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. So killed off the king and the queen, and that panicked everybody. And so other nations began to attack them and try to bring back order, and they then went out and attacked the other nations, and so Europe was plunged into various battles and wars. So all of that increased the stress at home. They got wars on the outside, as the Bible says, wars on the outside and fighting is on the inside, and things became pretty scary. And the National Assembly formed the Committee of Public Safety, and this was a group that was supposed to be keeping the public safe. What they meant by that was, though, they were looking out. This was the time of great conspiracy theories. They all believed that everybody else was a traitor. And the Committee of Public Safety ended up, during the Reign of Terror, sending everybody off to the execution squad. And it got to the stage there where they actually brought in laws to say that you could dob in anybody you thought didn't like the government or the whole revolution system, and people could be dobbing in their neighbours, and if you brought a false accusation, there was no comeback. So you had nothing to lose. If you didn't like the person that was in the house next to you or something, you could accuse them, and without any real trials or anything, they'd be hauled off. And again, there were massacres, there were all sorts of terrible things. A lot of mob-type rule. So it's particularly 1793, 1794, what was called the Reign of Terror. Ultimately, and again, scene there of the guillotine. On this particular occasion, Robespierre, who had been sort of at the forefront of things and eventually got extremely violent and went a little bit crazy and was executing people here, there, and everywhere. He ended up getting executed by the people who were all worried that he was going to execute them. And that sort of pretty much sums up the French Revolution. And it keeps going in that way. There were some terrible things that were done in different parts of France, as well as they found that the guillotine was a bit slow in some cases, so they lined people up and put them in front of firing squads. In some cases, they burnt them alive. In one place or a number of places, they put them out in boats into the river and sank them, sort of tied them to the boats or tied them to weights and this sort of stuff, and just sank people en masse, drowned them in the rivers. So it was terrible days to be living in. And this is what man ends up doing, unfortunately, even though he might have high ideals to start with. This is Robespierre. He eventually got so crazy he was killing everybody off. He then went into the assembly there at one stage and he said, I've got a list of people here who are traitors who I'm going to denounce, but I'm not going to tell you who they are. And pretty much everybody that by that stage had had enough. And they realised they could all be sent off to the execution squad, and so they attacked him and they sent him off to be guillotined. He'd already sent other people who had worked with him to bring the revolution about. He'd sent them off. He'd been a traitor to them, and so it was. Here he is being put there, getting ready for the guillotine, and he came to the end the same way that he had brought the end to many people. So the symbol of the Bible was a noisome and grievous sore. We've got a picture here. This is a picture of smallpox, a drawing of smallpox. And that was, as I say, a terrible disease that was raging around at the time and has been around for a long, long time. Back in the time of Moses and Aaron, when they had the 10 plagues of Egypt there, and the Lord was bringing the plagues upon Egypt, one of the plagues was a boil or an ulcer. It's the same word. So it says, they took the ashes of the furnace and stood before Pharaoh, and Moses sprinkled it upward toward heaven, and it became a boil breaking forth with blains, or in other words, with eruptions, pus, etc. Not very nice, upon man and upon beast. And the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils of the ulcers, for the boil was upon the magicians and upon all the Egyptians. So a very similar thing. It was upon not the people of God, but the people who were of Egypt. And again, a similar sort of situation. The picture there is just an animation of a smallpox virus. And of course, as we know, the virus gets in there and it brings forth things that are not supposed to be there. Now, the sores that it's talking about, this corruption that's within, which sort of breaks forth and has a terrible effect, is something that goes right through the vials. And we see in the fifth one here, this is talking about the fifth vial, which we'll talk about later on. It says, and the fifth angel poured out his vial upon the seat of the beast, and his kingdom was full of darkness. And they gnawed their tongues for pain, and they blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, and repented not of their deeds. So the sores were going on through all those vials. In other words, the whole influence of the French Revolution and the revolutionary fervour and everything else was causing great distress and great destruction to the Catholic Church right the way through, and eventually actually even to, as it says there, the seat of the beast, which was Rome, and the papacy itself. So this was an ongoing situation. Now, if we have a look at a couple of scriptures just to show what the Lord means when he talks about sores coming upon the people here in a symbolic sense, he talks the same way about Israel when Israel became corrupt and got involved with idolatry, etc. And this is how he puts it. In Isaiah, he says, "Ah, sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, a seed of evildoers, children that are corrupters. They have forsaken the Lord, they have provoked the Holy One of Israel unto anger, they have gone away backward. Why should you be stricken any more? You will revolt more and more. The whole head is sick and the whole heart faint." So again, talking about people revolting, and they were revolting, and in more ways than one. And as he says, the whole head is sick, the whole heart faint. And goes on to say, from the sole of their foot even unto the head there is no soundness or no health in it, but wounds and bruises and putrefying sores. They have not been closed, neither bound up, neither mollified with ointment. So he looks at Israel as having this corruption, this idolatry and everything else, and its wickedness, that they are rebellious, that they are revolting, and that they are like this breaking forth of these putrefying sores, these ulcers, which are breaking forth. And again, smallpox is a very good example of that. It may well have been the plague that took place in Egypt. There's a number of people that believe that that's probably what it was. It certainly was around at those times. Another scripture in Psalms, the Lord talks in a similar way. He said, "There is no soundness or health in my flesh because of thine anger, neither is there any rest in my bones because of my sin. For mine iniquities are gone over mine head, as an heavy burden they are too heavy for me. My wounds stink and are corrupt because of my foolishness." So King David here is saying, I've lost my health in that sense spiritually, and because of your anger, again, we think of the vials of the bowls of wrath that the Lord is pouring out there. And again, because of his sin, he has no rest. He's in pain, he's in agony, and he is corrupt. So again, it's a loathsome sort of a situation. So this is what the Lord's talking about. He's talking about corruption. He goes on to say, "I am troubled, I am bowed down greatly, I go mourning all the day long, for my loins are filled with a loathsome disease, and there is no soundness in my flesh." So again, if we want an interpretation of what the sores mean in the book of Revelation there, this is what it's talking about: a situation, individuals or a nation which have become corrupt, and that corruption is coming to the surface, breaking out in revolution and terrible things happening. And of course, that all stems from the mind. And as the Lord says here, the heart or the mind is deceitful above all things. It is exceedingly perverse and corrupt and severely, mortally sick. Who can know it, perceive, understand, be acquainted with his own heart and mind? So that's the way the Lord looks at it. It's these thoughts. Again, we think about the philosophers who maybe had influence upon the revolution. A lot of them, by the way, from what we know, from what you can read, they wouldn't have liked the idea of the revolution at all. One of them, not one of those that I mentioned, but one of them did actually survive to see it, and he said, "I regret everything that I said, everything that he'd sort of suggested, because he saw the end result." And a lot of them would have been horrified to see the things that happened there, and to see themselves being quoted sometimes in defence of those things. So a couple of quotes from history, and just where, again, they tend to talk about the French Revolution in the same language as the scripture does, in the sense of it being a disease. In 1858, now, I did look that name up. In 1858, Alexis de Tocqueville, something like that. Okay. Alexis de Tocqueville noted, "There is, moreover, in this disease of the French Revolution, something very strange that I can sense, though I cannot describe it properly or analyse its causes. It is a virus of a new and unknown kind. There have been violent revolutions in the world before, but the immoderate, violent, and radical, desperate, bold, almost crazed, and yet powerful and effective character of these revolutionaries has no precedence. It seems to me, in the great social agitations of past centuries, where did this new race come from? For the same men are still with us, even though the circumstances are different now, and they have a progeny everywhere in the civilized world. It is to an examination of that virus and these questions that we now turn." So, historian quoting somebody that talked about it as a disease, and she also saying that we will now look at the thoughts behind this particular, if you like, moral or political virus that affected France and the world there. Got on the side there some ladies. They had some of these ladies at the guillotines who would, they were sort of not allowed to do certain things, but some of them were pretty vicious, and they loved to watch the executions and were sort of pushing on the executions and goading the people to kill off all the traitors, which could be anybody and anybody and everybody. And so they have a particular name, but I have forgotten it. So anyway, the ladies were involved. As a matter of fact, in a lot of the things in the French Revolution, they were involved sometimes a lot more than the men. So they were just as bloodthirsty. And of course, it says this disease, if you like, was to come upon the men which had the mark of the beast. We've got some of the clergy there, the bishops and archbishops and priests. Again, these were the men of the time. So again, another quote on that particular point. It says, the revolution of 1789 was the breaking out of a local disease peculiar to the Roman Catholic nations and governments of southern Europe. So again, we see it talks about it like a local disease, is the way that it uses that imagery there, and that it is especially connected with the Roman Catholic nations, as the scripture said it would be in governments of southern Europe. The immense triumphs of the revolution in Roman Catholic countries were owing to the despair created by an effete aristocracy and a hypocritical priesthood. In the east of Europe, its success was commensurate with the defects of the old system and the inward power of reform, but it there never showed the malignity of the disease. This was exclusively proper to the countries where it was indigenous, this France and the south of Europe. Again, Northern Europe was more Protestant strength there, but south of Europe was very much the Catholic area and the original Western Empire of Rome area. So again, very much talking about it as a disease which is particularly focused, even though it had an effect right throughout Europe eventually, but the source was Catholic Europe, and that's what had the effect. Now, I can see that I'm not going to get through this, so I don't want to go too long. So I think I will leave it there. It's probably a good spot to leave it, and I'll do the rest, which is probably another half, to be honest. I'm hoping to do this one vial in one presentation, but we might have to do it in two. So we'll leave it there for tonight, and we'll pick that up again maybe in a couple of weeks' time.